Going live. All right. Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to this webinar brought to you by Certn. Curious to know a little bit, where is everyone coming in from? Feel free to put it in the chat. My name is Maya, and my pronouns are she and her, and I'm the PNC advisor here at Certn. And today we're going to be talking about how HR professionals can best navigate the complexities of conducting compliant screening. And so before we introduce our speakers and dive into things, we'd love for you to take part in a couple of quick polls we have running, and we'll share the results later on. All right, we've got, fun. We got some people. Toronto, kick off the polls. Are the polls running? Perfect. Amazing. Lots of people from Ottawa, Calgary, Victoria, Toronto. Exciting. Fantastic. I'll let those run. Just so we get a few things off the bat here. We'll also be taking audience questions and comments today. So please post your questions for our panel at any point in the question box to the right of the video player, and we'll get to as many as we can towards the end of the discussion. If you'd like a particular question or person to be answering that question specifically, please do include their name. My legal team has asked me to read this before we get into the webinar. So please note that the information shared today in this webinar is intended for general informational purposes only and should not be construed as legal advice. None of us are lawyers, unfortunately or fortunately. The insights provided by our team are broad in nature and may not address specific legal requirements applicable to region, industry, or particular circumstances. So we strongly recommend consulting with qualified legal professionals to ensure compliance with relevant laws and regulations in your jurisdiction. Now for today's discussion, I'm joined by two knowledgeable speakers with direct experience in navigating the complexities of hiring programs. I would love to first introduce Melissa, head of PNC here at Certn, a doctoral student and founder of Vision Leadership Consulting. Melissa, can you go ahead and give us a quick little intro and a fun fact about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. Really excited to be here. So I am the head of people and culture here at Certn. I have about 25-year career now. Every time that year goes up, it's like, oh, but it is my background was in sales and operations leadership in banking and insurance, and kind of made my way into people and culture because that's where my passion always has been. Fun fact about me. So fun fact about me is, we were talking about this earlier today, but I have lived in 23 houses. So, and my career's been 25 years old, so I'll let you do the math on the rest, but that's a lot of moving.
That's what we have in common. We both love moving. I've also moved about 10 times in the past 5 years, so super fun to run a background check on me, you know. I'm going to now pass it over to Byron. Byron, can you give us a little bit of info about yourself? You're the director of product here at Certn and immediate past chair of the Industry Practices Committee at the PBSA. Don't forget to include a fun fact.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Maya. Hello, everyone. My name is Byron Alvord, and as Maya mentioned, I am director of product here at Certn. I've been in the background screening space for 10 plus years, and I've been really active in the PBSA or the Professional Background Screening Association. So get to spend a lot of time with industry colleagues and looking at how best we can move our industry forward. Have had the chance to be in a chair of the Industry Practices Committee here based out of the US, and definitely a pleasure to be here today.
And a
fun fact. I almost got away with that one. I love to drink coffee, like an obscene amount of coffee, anywhere between 14 and 20 cups a day. Most individuals say that is insane, but that is what keeps me going day in and day out.
And what was the best prank played on you? Since we're on the topic of coffee.
Oh, since we're on the topic.
Yeah.
So I was in Victoria and I had an iced coffee that I got from a coffee shop from around the way. And I was busy. I went to the restroom and I came back and I took a drink out of my seemingly normal iced coffee, and it had been switched out with iced coffee that had cubes of salt water in it. And it was a plan that Maya had been orchestrating for quite some time because she had to make the salt water ice cubes, wait for me to go away, come back, and leave my drink unattended. And she pulled that off without a hitch, which was actually pretty incredible. So I'll give you that, Maya.
All right, we're actually not here to talk about coffee, but I would like to know a little bit more about social media screening. We want to set the stage here for everyone, for anyone who's not familiar with it. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Byron, to start us off. What is social media screening?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the first things to kind of talk about is just social media in general, that it's something that has become something inside of our life every day. It's shaping how we connect, how we communicate, even how we work. Essentially, personal updates to professional networking on LinkedIn. It's basically a place where we're showcasing who we are, we're sharing our opinions about ourselves and others, and we're engaging in the world. But when we're doing that, we're also leaving a digital footprint that can create lasting impressions on new friends, new bosses, new landlords. And part of that is going into social media screening. So what is social media screening? This is essentially the process of reviewing potential individuals, whether it's employees, potential employees, friends, looking at their social media profiles, their online activity, to basically gain insight into their character, their behavior, as well as any potential outcome that you might be looking for. It might actually be maybe they're looking for a job, maybe they're looking to rent a place, and you're just trying to learn a little bit more about them. Some of the information that you might see can be concerning information, maybe inappropriate posts, comments, images, things of that nature. But really, what we're here to talk about today is when you are doing that, what is the best ways for you to be able to do that? So when you are doing social media screening, I mentioned some things, but it's possible that you're doing some sort of screening today when you're hiring someone or bringing someone along. When you're thinking about this, how many individuals, when you are hiring an individual, are you looking at their LinkedIn, or even perhaps looking at somebody's Facebook or Instagram? In many instances, recruiters, hiring managers, or people that might know them on a personal level might actually be doing that. Which, if you don't have a proper policy in place, it could set you up for some risk.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just looking at some of our poll results here. So how many of us run social media screening on candidates? And it looks like we have about 46% of people saying never, it's not part of our program. So almost half of us here. And then we have sometimes at about 33%. So really interesting. I'm curious to know, Melissa, as a PNC exec, what have you seen during your career?
I think Barb kind of touched on it here too. It's two questions you're almost asking is, do you have a social media screening policy and a way that you, like a consistent way that you follow in every hire, in some hires, specific hires, or do you have people who, whether it be hiring managers or people in your HR, people in culture, recruitment team, that are sort of kind of doing social media checks? And I think those are the two things that I've seen emerge kind of over the last 10 years. And really, I think that the troublesome thing is you see more of the latter, where no, we don't do social media checks, but we kind of do, right? And sometimes we do, and it depends who's sitting at the desk and who has time, and then you see some of that bias and those things creep in. So it's great to see that there is a trend where it is needed, where it is required, if there is a business case why we need to be looking at candidate social media background screening. We understand why, we understand where, we understand which roles, and that then you're taking kind of a cohesive approach, or like a standard approach, rather than saying we just don't do that here. If your answer is we don't do that here, you might not know what's happening, and it might be being done even when you don't know. And so if there's no structure around it, that can be pretty tricky too.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And So now that we're kind of setting the stage for social media, we understand a little bit about what it is. I'm also going to bring back some more of our poll results here to understand about how many folks here have passed on someone based on something they found on social media. And so we have about 41% of folks here who have passed and made a decision based on someone's social media profile, whether that may be through an official, like through a third-party provider, or through doing it ad hoc on your own. I'm curious to know what kind of practical steps, now that we understand the stage a little bit, what social media screening is, what are those practical steps that an organization should take to build that compliant screening media or social media screening platform? Just like you were kind of mentioning, Melissa, I'll put this one to you, Byron. What comes to mind?
Yeah, I think Melissa touched on it slightly, but I think the first thing is when you're looking at your organization is ensuring you have a proper policy and procedure in place before conducting social media screening. So essentially, define the purpose and the scope of social media screening. You should clearly define why you're doing social media screening, what's being implemented, and what platforms are even being reviewed. So you're really trying to look at maybe mitigating risk, like inappropriate behavior, discriminatory remarks, maybe brand misalignment. But you're going to need to actually define what are those inappropriate behaviors? What are those discriminatory remarks? What is brand misalignment? And what do those actually mean? As you're going through this, you should also, like Maya mentioned, talk to legal and your compliance team, because in many instances, when you're looking at the relative laws, you do need to look at different privacy laws, different anti-discrimination laws, FCRA compliance if you're in the States. All of that type of stuff needs to be taken into account when you're creating your policy. And then as you kind of move forward, looking at setting clear criteria in your review and in your policy. So this is, like I mentioned, establishing what is that particular criteria that you're looking for that may have somebody pass or may have somebody not meet what you're looking at. So again, maybe that's hate speech and discriminatory remarks, or what do you do with certain violent posts, or even potentially illegal activities, all of that stuff. As well as, I don't want to say you just have negative things on social media. There's a lot of individuals that you could be looking in, and you're looking for individuals that have positive outlooks and positive brand awareness and positive things of that nature as well. So it's not always just looking for, oh, this individual or this thing was wrong or bad. You can even have a policy that looks at something for positive. And then I'd say the last part of this piece would be more around, when you're doing that, you need to maintain consistency and fairness as you've created that program. So in that policy and procedure is, if you have certain jobs, certain roles that you're hiring for, you're ensuring that if it's a cashier or if it's a store clerk, you're treating every one of them with the same rules and rigor across the board. You're not making adjustments because you're a hiring manager and I really like this candidate, so I'm going to make the exception here. Those are the things that you need to try to avoid when creating your policy and program.
And Melissa, I saw you kind of nodding there. Is there anything you wanted to add to this as well?
Yeah, I think I really liked where you ended there, but it's really easy then to say, okay, no, I'm going to apply my judgment this time. When you don't have a really rigorous set of like why we're doing this, what rules, again, all those things kind of I shared at the beginning. If you don't have that in place, you can get that creep of like, but not this time, sometimes, but not this. Why are we doing that? When are we doing that? How does it make sense? Like, that's just kind of what I was like, really, really digging what Byron was saying.
Yeah, absolutely. I was also thinking the consistency of how we're applying is often where we'll get into trouble in this space, right? Are we applying these policies consistently across all people? I'm curious to know, could you discuss some of those examples of how inconsistent social media practices could really impact an organization's reputation or expose them to risk, Melissa?
Absolutely. I think the one thing kind of fundamental to remember whenever it comes to hiring or dealing with people in general is we are built to search for people like us. Like that, this is just a universal truth that we know about how human biology works. Like we were kind of built to be in tribes, right? So we will seek those out consistently if we're not actively aware of that bias that comes into play. And so what happens when you're inconsistent with any policy or any procedure is that just gives that bias room to grow. Like it gives it room to go, okay, I see this person. And even if it is positive things that you're informally looking for on someone's social media, you're still looking for your version of that, right? Now, I'm going to say, with the exception of, if is this some kind of external facing role for your organization where other people are going to be seeking out their public profiles and images, and it really is important that aligns with your brand. That is very true. But those cases I think are few and far between. Those really, really strong cases for where you need to do a thorough social media background check. There are other places where this applies, but the why is important. Like, why does it matter if we disagree on certain things? Um, you know, Notwithstanding, like obviously, like violence, those kinds of things, hate speech. There's some things that are really easy to say, okay, this is so far beyond the line. But I know we have mostly HR and people, professionals on the line. The hardest thing is when it's something that doesn't rub you the right way, but isn't against your code of conduct or isn't against. It's like if I took it in that context, it is, but in another context, maybe there's another side to the story. And you don't get to have those nuanced conversations, especially if you're doing your own one-off searches or not applying whatever that policy or organization has come up with in a standard way. So then the real risks are you at risk of breaching some kind of privacy policy? I think, May, you talked about at the beginning, we are not here to provide legal advice, and every region is going to have different rules, and we couldn't possibly provide that kind of guidance. But you will have different rules, different laws come into place about privacy. Is this something you're allowed to do? Whereas if you engage with an organization and you have a really good policy around what this is, what this isn't, what the purpose is, you're not going to run into those things versus when you have people doing kind of their one-off personal assessment of someone's social media.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note of doing our one-offs, that was one of our questions in the poll. And it does look like about 27% of us do in-house social media checks. So that's interesting to note. But there was a question that came in ahead of the webinar that I'm curious to get your guys' perspective on. You did mention you've kind of answered this in some capacity as well, but people have asked what types of behavior on social media matter, whether it's job relevant and what doesn't. Do either of you feel like you can answer that for us?
Yeah, I can start with it, and then Melissa, if you wanted to add anything in. I think one of the key things is all around the relevance to the position and relevance to what that individual is going to be doing. And do you really have a reason to care about that? So there's not a blanket statement that says in every single circumstance you can't like somebody that has this violent post or that somebody has done this specific thing. You do have to look at every role, every position that you're trying to fill and say, how does, I don't know, harassment and violence and all these other things, how do they align with this role? What do I care about? What do I not care about? Who do I want to see in these type of positions? And then as you start creating that, you're going to start realizing there might be a little bit more room than you anticipated to remove bias or anything like that. Or there might be, maybe it's a little bit more all across the board. Hey, I don't want X, Y, and Z, or this doesn't align with what we're looking for. So it kind of goes back to what I talked about when you're defining your policies and your procedures, is not just maintaining your consistency and fairness, but when you need to set clear criteria for what that is to review. And setting that clear criteria can be based on position, can be based on, or should be based on position, should be based on the location in which they are, should be also in line with privacy laws and all those type of things you have to take into account. It's not as easy as just saying, oh, Byron, you made a negative post, you're now not getting the job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Melissa, would you add anything?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really important to know too, then, just because I don't have a social media presence sharing these kinds of things doesn't mean it's not there. So are we using this sometimes as a very inadequate safety, like something that makes us feel safe and good about the person we're hiring? But if you didn't find something on there, that doesn't mean it's not there, right? Like, so I could be having personal conversations that are really offensive, like my whatever that looks like, that you're screening for. Again, being conscious of the fact that, if you found one candidate and you're not in love with their social media profile, and your other candidate has no public social media profile, you're really not comparing apples to apples. So then you can get into some bias there too, of what's there. Again, I think all of that is notwithstanding, if there is a search and there is something really obvious that this person does not fit here, or this person, is not going to work in this role, there's going to be those. But a lot more of the time, if you don't have a good process in place, it's going to be all the gray in between that people are making kind of gut check decisions on. That's really, really going to get you in trouble.
Yeah, absolutely. And really emphasizing that point on, like, it's one piece of the puzzle. And when you're not comparing across apples to apples, it can be extra challenging. So making sure that we bake that into our policies and our decision-making processes, and programs as well. There was a question that I just saw in the question box. Well, actually, there's quite a few, but one that kind of feels on brand right now for what we're talking about is, how often do employers come across deal-breaking content during social media screenings? And this question was also asked before the webinar in advance and in preparation. So I'm curious to know if you can answer that for us and what that kind of looks like. I'll pass it over to you, Melissa, to start, and then Byron, if there's anything you want to add on.
Sure. I would only have anecdotal kind of evidence, like things that I've read and researched on, and experiences that I've had. And I would say most of the time it is a negative, like someone looking for something negative is what pushes them away from a role, more than confirms, like, I'm really excited to onboard this person. It's like, this is the final check to see if there is something exclusionary, versus I'm going to look at this and assess if I like them as a person. I don't think many in talent acquisition are going in there with that conscious of a bias. So I would say more often than not, if it's coming down to being the decision maker, it's because something that person or that screening check has provided that is maybe more of a negative, versus now, if I have two candidates, I'm going to pick the one that the social media is. Generally, it's more of a risk aversion tool. So it would be more that someone finds something negative. As to how often that happens, I think that was baked in this question as well. I would have no kind of accurate line of sight. One, I think, is an organization that provides these checks. I'll let Byron kind of confirm this, but we wouldn't hear back what the user does with that data or that information, whether or not they make the hire. That's kind of not really up to us. Again, I'll get Byron to confirm, but from an anecdotal perspective, just what I've seen in different organizations and what I've observed myself is, if it comes down to the background, a social media background check, it would be a negative pushing away more than a positive drawing in.
Awesome. Thank you. And is there anything you wanted to add to that, Byron?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what Melissa said is exactly right. And what we do here, and when we're doing social media screening, is we're providing a list of, or a bunch of information to hiring managers or individuals that are making decisions, and whatever they do with that information on whether they hire the individual or not, is really on that organization and what is in their policies and up to them. However, there is times when there are information that does get returned on the social media check. And I think if you're looking at how often do potential risks or posts come back in a social media check, we can get you that information, but that information does not directly correlate to, did this individual get a job?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that answer. And point taken on as an organization, we're really providing that information for others to make those decisions. And capturing all of those clients globally and what they decided to do or not to do based on a background check is pretty challenging for us to capture, but it is it's a really interesting question, right? It's probably something a lot of us are wondering, but one that's really challenging to capture that specific data. Again, another question similar along the same lines, and I think I know where you guys are probably going to go with this in terms of an answer, but how do you handle posts that may be misinterpreted or taken out of context to either of you?
For me, this is another reason why doing your own background checks is probably the most risky, because then it is up to that individual's interpretation rather than some kind of system that's been set up to identify either keywords or images, things like that, and then having a professional look at the full context so they can provide more feedback on a professional report, right? So what the end user is getting isn't necessarily, what the whole feed looks like. It's like this thing was cited and these are the reasons it may be concerning, but without the bias or the context that would automatically go in if it's an individual hiring manager or individual within an organization looking, you're going to fill in the gaps and put in that context. So I think for me, that's another reason why, if background checks are an important part of your search, or sorry, if a social media background check, you've identified this role or this job, it is an important part of that search, then really making sure that you're having the right people do it or the right organizations do it and not just taking one look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And is there anything you wanted to add to that, Byron?
Yeah, I do think this is where doing individualized assessments for those individuals is super important as well.
Mm-hmm.
So while social media checks, we're going to look and we're going to pull the information that we can, whether it's misinterpreted or not. Let's just say, hey, there was a violent post that was there. I always encourage, before you're making those decisions and you have an opportunity to talk to that person, it might be worth having that conversation with them. Hey, we saw this post, can you give me more context behind it? Do you want to give us any more information on there? So that is even an opportunity to give you a little bit more clarity on, hey, now the person's acknowledged that I did post this. Do I have an opportunity to say this was taken out of context? And then you still ultimately have that decision. As it goes for how that information gets on there as well, there are many ways that our social media check essentially is able to look, say, okay, what does this post mean or look like? It does take cultural, language, all of those things into account to be able to say, does this get onto the report? And then when it does get on the report, that's why we're encouraged everybody to take a look at that and make sure that it does align with you.
Yeah, and really kind of emphasizing that point, like, thank you so much, Byron, for adding that in, having the conversation with an individual that could be part of your process, right? And that is part of our process to baked in. If there's not an obvious decision on the report, then we kind of go to our questions that are kind of to go for, that we ask ourselves in those situations where we're unsure. And sometimes we ask ourselves those questions as part of our process, also going over to the candidate and just asking them directly if we do need some more context or more information. That can be baked into your process as well. So thank you very much for answering those. I'm gonna take some more audience questions a little bit later, but I'm gonna bring us to whether we're taking those in-house or external checks, and bring us back to that. Curious to know who could we possibly use as a third-party service for this? Not a plug, promise. Over to you, Byron.
I do think with this, though, Melissa has mentioned it's super important that you do have that defined process and you are trying to use either a third-party service or a service that's outside of your own organization. So much like how you're doing background screening and you're not normally doing background screening in-house, you are going external. Social media checks shouldn't really stray from that either. So using a third-party service for social media screening has several advantages. it can mitigate your risk. It can help you ensure compliance as well as maintain fairness during your hiring process. So like some of the things we've touched on before is we do this as background screening for our every day. We have thousands of customers, lots of market research and insights, and working with individuals to know, okay, how do we want to offer this? What does this need to look like? So we in turn become kind of that expert in the space. With that, we know the legal and regulatory compliance and can help individuals guide that. We can also help with avoiding bias, or when I say we, but really third parties can help with avoiding the bias. They provide objective, standardized reports, usually excluding any of those protected characteristics. So that's one important key. Making sure, things like race, gender, religion, those type of things are not included on the report to help prevent discrimination, as well as we do third parties will do things through candidate consent. So things ensuring that we are getting consent from candidates. Candidates do know what is happening. They have the consent disclosures, understand those type of things. Along with that, you do have the ability to kind of take advantage of what the third party organization may have created. So things like automated systems and or trained professionals that can help conduct the review, ensuring that consistent criteria, as well as standardized reporting. So having all the findings and relevant findings on the report so you can actually see that in a consistent manner is really important as well.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Byron. Is there anything you want to add to that piece right there around the why, Melissa, and the third-party service? Right.
I think just reiterating what we've kind of been saying, if there is a way to get bias out of social media screening, it is third-party service. Like that is the way to get some of those questions out and to have a standardized approach. Not necessarily for the organization, but again, for the roles. So like, why does this role need this background check? And then we do it every single time when we hire for this or similar roles, whatever we've decided is in scope.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. This kind of answers some of my next questions that we're going to get into. So I'm going to just skip us over to some of those audience questions. There's so many great questions coming in, hard to read all of them at the same time. But I'm going to start off with a question. This is a great question. Is it advised to use machine review AI to remove implicit bias in review process to protect from discrimination risk? With the caveat that we're not legal professionals with that caveat there. But yes.
So that first, however, I would say like it's just like I tell members of my team and I tell kind of every professional service, it's, AI isn't going to take your job, but someone who uses AI might. So it is always just layering in that personal expertise because it's wrong enough, right? I'm sure all of you have had that. I love AI, and I think it's such a great tool, productivity tool, all of those things. So I do think there is a space for it to be used to appropriately kind of like narrow down what you're looking for, but it's input in equals input out, right? So if you're not using it consistently, if you haven't set up this policy and a framework within your organization, you're going to have the same negative effects as you would if it was just individuals going and kind of scrolling through someone's social media feed. So it comes back again to consistency, and that human element I think is always going to be required. Like I was kind of speaking to where you do see something that could be taken out of context. When you have a third-party vendor that has a process, has trained professionals, they can do that secondary look to say what's coming up here, what's not coming up here. It's for me, it's a yes and. So yes, the tool is going to have that baked in, but you also need the human and the professional element as well.
Agreed. Absolutely. And Byron, is there anything you wanted to add to here?
Yeah, I think going with what Melissa was saying, you had that in those pieces, but also I think there was a secondary part to that question around using AI just to be able to do profile review or things of that nature. And one thing that we have in our social media tools today is we do utilize AI to help identify profiles, things that go into certain risk classifications or things that you might be looking for, to then be able to pull that out and have individuals look at it and say, okay, does this actually fit in that? Do we need to retrain a model? Do you need to do all of those type of things? That is a part of the service.
Okay, absolutely. Next question. To what degree does Certn automate our profile review? Machine AI.
I sort of just answered that.
Okay. Oh wait, sorry. Yeah. Good call. So good job. Most background checks don't communicate with the person they're conducting the check for. So how can we combat this?
I think with this question, it's kind of a unique one, because it really depends on the hiring organization or property manager or whomever is running the background check for which reason. At Certn, what we do is we provide background checks for our clients that are running background checks for a litany of reasons. And when they run those background checks, we either are working directly with the candidate to collect candidate consent and get that information directly from the candidate, or working closely with our client who has collected candidate consent and has the information that we need to do the check. And when we do that check, we provide them with the information. Now, whether there's adverse information on that report or not, does not dictate whether somebody's gotten the position or not. That's really up to the communication style of that organization to notify the individual that they either won't be hired or, hey, we're going to have conversations. I will say some trends that you've seen in the US market, I'll use Los Angeles specifically, is something known as the Fair Chance Hiring Ordinance, or basically the requirement to do an individualized assessment on anybody that comes, that has a background check that you're not going to hire them for. So you're actually seeing some case law come out saying, hey, if you're not going to hire an individual, you actually have to do an individualized assessment and have this conversation with that individual. So really interesting to see, but those type of things are out there. And if I'm not sure who asked this question, but if you're not seeing that or want to create a program where you're more transparent with your employees or tenants or whomever, feel free to reach out and we can definitely be of assistance there.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Groovy. To the next question. How do we ensure that social media content you find is in fact the proper candidate? And this is something that comes up quite a bit. Who'd like to take this?
Yeah. I'll talk to it because it's directly related to how the product works. So when you order a social media checker, you have that. We do ask for a few clarifying things from the individual. We have the name, we have email, date of birth, some instances high school, as well as they can provide social media handles. Then what happens is that search is then run, and when we can either discover additional ones, or we'll actually run and see, do these social media handles actually match what was provided? And if they do, we would go ahead and still report on that. What we do is we do require to have a minimum amount of identifiers before you can report something on that. So we really like the right amount of accuracy, as well as ensuring that we can identify that this is that person. So most of the time you're having 3 identifiers, whether that's a full name match, an email match, and date of birth match. And then maybe you match that to another profile, and that profile pic also had the same profile pic as somewhere else, and it had another identifier. So then it kind of starts becoming a layered approach in identifying, are these, or is this social media tied to the individual that we're supposed to be doing the check on?
Wow, cool. That's awesome to hear. So thank you. Um, from the crowd, another question. I might put this one to you, Melissa, but how do you protect against discrimination when a recruitment professional's personal beliefs do not line up with the candidate's beliefs? For example, and this is something that can be quite prevalent today too, but advocacy for certain marginalized groups, for example, or a political stance or advocacy for or against ongoing wars or genocides. That's how can we protect against that side of things?
I still think, hi, Sihan, by the way. I still think that, really understanding where checks are required and where they are not, and then having the right people doing them is the thing we've kind of talked about, because no, an individual recruiter should not be pulling up your profile by themselves. That's my kind of belief. And I think that's the way that we try and get some of this bias out of most of the bias out of the system. If you do have individuals, yes, we're going to look at it through the lens of what we believe in, right? That's going to happen whether someone's super conscious about that or not, or just plants a little seed of doubt if there's some misalignment with things that you believe. So I think it's a really good call out, and it is, for me, like such a great example of why it's not always obvious. And I answer that really tentatively, because for most of us, the things that we believe really deeply, and they are obvious. But we also have to be aware that we've got to coexist with people who disagree with us, right? So having someone in your workplace already that disagrees with you, many of us, that happens every single day, to really like build a workplace intentionally that has none of that, that's not a healthy thing for any of us. So I think it's having a really strong policy, whether you use social media background checks or not, because then there can be some accountability. If you're just saying we don't have a social media background check policy, then people are doing it, right? Whereas if you have one, at least then you can have some structure, some consequences, some accountability around if they're happening off the side of someone's desk and they shouldn't be, right? And then layer in on top of that the legal implications of someone doing them when they're not trained to, shouldn't be, and applying just their personal bias to each of those decisions all of the time. So for me, it is kind of like saying we don't have an AI policy, or we say you're not allowed to use it. It needs to be more than that. It needs to be, we don't do social media background checks, and this is why. We do them in these specific cases, and this is why, and this is how they're handled. They're not handled by someone just kind of doing their once over. Did you see anything that's disturbing? Like, because that metric is going to be different for each of us. So being really, really clear, whether it's, an actual grid that you go through to answer certain things when you're doing that check, or ideally, again, outsourcing, so it's not something that you're doing internally. I think that is the answer to that really hard question. And then we have to just, people are people. You're going to have really great recruiters that are open to lots of different kinds of people, and you're going to have recruiters that are maybe a bit fixed in their ways. And so by really clearly stating this is not something that you're permitted to do, then you can have some accountability, and kind of a path forward, and hopefully some clarity for your candidates as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Melissa. And +1 on really, acknowledging that this is going to happen likely. So how can we create those guardrails for this kind of space, and to make sure that we are creating a place where people are making better decisions than just, the wild, wild west. So that's an awesome answer. Thank you very much. Next question from the crowd. Is there a best practice for how far back we should be looking into a person's social media content? I'll pass this one to you, Byron, to start us off with this question.
Yeah. So with this question, I think my answer here is going to say it depends on really where you're at, the locations, all of that good stuff. But usually it's you'll see anywhere between 3 years all the way to 10 years. A lot of people land on 7 years in FCRA in the US market. That's so common on a 7-year mark. But really it's going to be what you deem relevant as an organization, along with the laws and what's publicly available. So I would ensure you talk to your legal team about that to determine.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And kind of to piggyback onto that, do we this is do we have to let people know that we are running social media checks on someone? Like, do we have to disclose to applicants that that's what we're doing? And this is a question from Danielle. Do you have
Yes. So I will say candidate consent is very, very important. Not just social media screening, background screening in general. If you're doing any sort of screening, you do need candidate consent. Candidates do need to know what information you're using, what information, who's getting their information, and what information you're using to make decisions. So like that type of stuff, it is very important. But if you want to know specifics or have any questions on that, you can absolutely reach out to us here at Certn, and we'll be able to help you there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of makes me laugh because I think that's like the number one question that I get as when people are like, where do you work? A background check company? Can you run a background check on this person? And it's just like, absolutely not. What do you think I am? But consent is so, so, so important. And it's also part of really building that transparent process and making it fair and equitable for everyone. So double down on what you just said there, Byron. There's another question.
I just think sorry, do you mind if I jump in on the years
yeah.
thing? I think like 7 years, 10 years for me, cool. Like I'm approaching my mid 40s. You're going to get what you're going to get. I think about my 21-year-old son and going back 10 years. We have a generation, two now, like just behind me, that have grown up with these platforms, that have grown up. They have like the history of their lives, right? And do I want everything I did when I was 16 or 17 to be looked at by every employer? Or even, I saw that question about a tenant situation come up in the question too. Like, so I think that's another one of those things. What roles are we doing these for and why? And, who else is going to be looking? I think that should be kind of a deciding factor. Is this a public facing role where we feel like there is some risk of someone, else looking from outside of the company that could put us at a reputation risk or financial risk? Like if that is the role, okay. But I just had to say on that years thing, I think that's a different question for different generations for sure.
Yeah, and a really curious thing as we move, as our workforce includes so many more generations working in our workplaces these days, where you might be pulling and comparing two candidates. We have a candidate that has like not much in their background on social media, and someone's life who's just grown up on social. Like, I sure hope nothing from my high school times is found in a background check, because it's just embarrassing what I used to post on Facebook. Shocking times. And that's not something I'd want, but at the same time, how are we creating those policies? How are they fair and equitable? What information are we looking for? What do we need to have there? What do we not need to have there? So totally makes sense.
And how are we applying the context, right? Like I have a pretty public profile by choice. Like none of my stuff is private. So I'm thoughtful, I think, about what I post. But then I also say TikTok is like my off-brand content. And none of it is bad, but it's like silly and it's like not my professional persona. And like, I guess spoiler alert, if you want to find it, you will. But like I think about that as we think about, why social media background checks and who's doing them, again, is the most important part. If it is important to your organization for all of your roles, maybe you have a really good business case for that being the reason. Even better reason to be outsourcing it, to be, asking for professional help so you can eliminate some of that bias. And maybe time wasting. I'm sure I could fall into a TikTok that was really compelling and spend 10 hours there. So we don't want that happening either.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll have time for just a few more questions. In fact, actually, just kidding. We are wrapping up at time. So I am going, just kidding. No more questions, everyone. So sorry. But I would like to put it back to you, Melissa and Byron, just as a quick recap. If everyone was to take away 2 to 3 things from the whole webinar, what are those main key points that you really want to drill in? First, I'll let whoever wants to take that. Go ahead.
I can jump in. I think a thing I lead with in almost every context is whatever you're doing, do it intentionally. So I think about that in most aspects of my life and my work. Is it's something I'll ask people to do is whatever you're doing, do it intentionally. And then again, if your policy is we just don't do that, okay, is there a policy that says we don't do that? Or is it just something you're not thinking about? Because there are probably people in your organization that are using kind of back channels to do this themselves. So coming up with a policy, really, really important. Why are we doing this? When are we doing this? And get some consistency. I think those are my, what are you doing with intent? Is my question to anybody
Yeah.
doing these checks.
Love that. So really the intentionality and having those policies, clearly outlining that why. Love that. Over to you, Byron.
I think my big one is making sure you have defined policies and procedures that are consistent across the org. Like for me, I've worked with thousands of hiring managers across the globe, and that's always the number one thing is, do you have a reason to be doing this check? Do you have a reason? And what is that reason? And how does that actually apply to you as an organization? So if you don't have any clear policy and procedures in place, not just social media screening, but in general, it is something that you should consider looking at and talking with your council and your HR team to get in place sooner rather than later.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm really hearing, the emphasis on those policies, making sure that we're applying everything consistently and being really intentional about it. So thank you so much for all those great tips, both Melissa and Byron. I hope everyone here, I hope you've enjoyed our discussion today and found a few useful tips in here. Keep your eyes open on our inbox. We're going to be sending out a recording later on and with some insights along with a few handy resources and a checklist around compliance. So you won't want to miss that. Many thanks again to Melissa and Byron. I hope to see you all again soon. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye.